Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. This episode of the Marco Martins Revolution is brought to you by Vodcast TV, Johannesburg's premier shared podcast studio platform. If you've ever wanted to host a podcast for yourself or your business, simply never been a better place to do it than right here. Visit vodcasttv.com/revolution. Get yourself a discount on your first order of a podcast or podcast series. My guest today is a mom and a former addict in recovery. I don't actually know how to say that, but I'm going to just say it that way. A former addict in recovery, Jade Gomes. Welcome to the podcast.
A revolution is a fundamental and relatively sudden change in political power. An organization which occurs when the population revolts. This is the Marco Martins Revolution, powered by Vodcast TV. Visit vodcasttv.com for more.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're so welcome. Thank you for joining me here. And I've just enjoyed your story on social media in general. Very positive, very uplifting, but stern. That's how I would describe seeing you on socials. It's like it's positive, it's uplifting, but stern. It's not soft. And I think there's a balancing point that a lot of people tend to miss in this world of mental health in particular, which is something that I put addiction into that category. I put addiction straight into the mental health category. Is that when you're healing from a process, it's treat yourself with kindness, treat others with kindness. That's like a big part of getting healthy, but from a stern perspective. That's what I really like about your socials.
Yeah, so I suppose what you're picking up there is, okay, first of all, recovery is based on, my recovery, because everybody's recovery is an individual thing and it's personal. But for me, I've based the foundation of my recovery is on the 12 steps from Alcoholics Anonymous, and then their 5 pillars of recovery. But I think what you're noticing there when you speak of the sternness is probably me asserting boundaries, which is something that a lot of people in active addiction, actually people in general, just don't have and don't enforce. And it's not, people perceive me sometimes to be quite aggressive, but it's not aggression. It's intentional. I'm intentional about changing my life. And, and I know the place that I come from was so dark. And it was just so deeply, I was just in such a lot of pain, and it was so deep for me. So being in this program, for me, the most important thing is the message, and I'm in early recovery. So I'm bordering 6 months of sobriety. And I think that's important, because if in such a short time you can change your life in 6 months, what will it be like in a year or 2 years? Because in the rooms, in the fellowship, you go and you hear shares of people that are 10 years clean, 20 years clean, and that can be quite overwhelming for a newcomer. It can be, that's miles away. But again, you remind yourself that it's a just for today program. It's just for today. It's 24 hours that you just need to work those 5 pillars and you should be fine. But when I decided to go into recovery, when I decided to get the help and really putting so much work into it, I've realized that I am aggressive about my recovery. I'm excited about it. I'm intentional about it. I back it because I back myself now. Some of the amazing gifts of recovery is learning to have a self-esteem, to really step into your power and say, this is who I am, and I make no apologies for that, and also removing yourself of the need to get externally affirmed by other people, because the message ultimately is that if one person, which there have been many that have, made contact with me, many, addiction is something that is really, it is running riot in our society. Truly, it's running riot in our society, and people don't have the tools or the courage to talk about it because it is such a taboo subject. There's this perception that you need to be like a junkie under a bridge. And it's really not like that. I mean, it's in normal homes that look normal, inverted commas normal, professionals, kids, it's everywhere. But we're not holding space. And this is a struggle I have with social media, is that everybody's going on there and going, hey, my life is perfect. And you're only showing the good stuff. And I made the choice. I know you've seen my posts. I mean, I've put pictures on there when I was like deep in active addiction that ordinarily I would never show anyone because I'd be too embarrassed. But it's a reality of where it can take you. Like, it robs you of your essence. And I want to show people that, like, what it took from me. Addiction is a disease that is recognized by the World Health Organization. It is a behavioral disease, and people don't know that. They just think, and they think that it's only rooted in drugs and alcohol. Addiction is translated and manifests in many different ways.
I think the reason why people perceive it as very different to a disease, because it is very different to other diseases. Even though it's a disease, a lot of why people put a stigma attached towards it is that it's initially a choice.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that it's like, but you chose to drink. No one forced alcohol down your throat, whatever, whereas people don't choose cancer. You know, so there's a very distinct difference between alcoholism or addiction and cancer. However, from any mental health practitioner's standpoint, they'll look at it and be able to isolate it and say to you, yes, it meets all of these criteria to say it's a disease. This is something that's out of people's control when it gets to a certain point, at least, and that there's very active steps that they have to take in order to bring that disease to an end. But away from the disease, and it's something I want to revisit as we continue to speak about this, I wanted to ask you about the 5 pillars that you mentioned. And yes. I think because we're speaking about recovery, I want to get that subject out of the way and then delve into disease and the mental health condition of people who tend to find themselves in positions of addiction and things like that. Okay. So before we get there, can you just explain those 5 pillars that you use and why it's such a daily thing to go through?
Okay, so the 5 pillars of recovery are step work, which is your 12 steps. It's encouraged not to do it every day. You know, people do have their own lives, but also just to work through those 12 steps.
And what are those 12 steps?
Definitely. Okay, so
shall we bring them up?
Yeah, so I can, because I can explain it in a granular form because it is quite extensive. But
if we can just have like the Google definition of the 12 steps for now, just to give people an outline.
Okay, so the 12 steps of AA. So step 1 is admitting that we are powerless and our lives have become unmanageable. So that's basically the admittance of, I've got a problem and I need help. Mm-hmm. That's realizing that you cannot stop and that your life has become unmanageable. So your consequences you can no longer manage. Step 2 is came to believe that a power greater than ourselves would restore us to sanity. So that's what we refer to in the rooms as your higher power, because that's different for everyone. You know, AA, NA, CA, all the different fellowships are not a religious program. They are a spiritual one, and you need to define what your higher power is. So in the rooms, we refer to higher power, this and that and whatever, because nobody can dictate that.
Right. And it's largely based around people's individual faith, from an Islamic faith or Christianity.
Correct,
or any of those.
you know. So,
although I don't think Islamic faith would be common at Alcoholics Anonymous.
You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised. And then step 3 is made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. So that's, you know, surrendering to this process to our higher power. And then step 4 is made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. So step 4 is the most feared step in recovery because it requires rigorous honesty and it's about taking personal inventories. So for example, you really have to be so honest. If you want to recover, step 4 is the one you have to focus on the most, because in active addiction, we are not able to, there are symptoms of active addiction like dishonesty, manipulation, all your character defects come up in step 4. So actually having a look at what you've done and the role you've played in your own distraction is sometimes very overwhelming. So some people can spend a lot of time on step 4. There's even a prayer you say before you go do this, because I think like the realization of what has really been going on, because we lie to ourselves. I mean, I've been telling people I've been in active addiction for 2 years. I remember saying that. And I'm on step 8 now. And only once I finished my step 4, I was like, wow, this has been going on my whole life. So that's where, as much as other people have hurt us, and there have been people that have wronged us, and yes, they've done all those things. But every place you find yourself in life, you've made an active decision to be a role player in that situation. And taking ownership of that is very difficult. It's very, very difficult. So step 4 is...
So it's a point about accountability, essentially,
Correct.
is personal accountability. And then something else I'm picking up about the 12 steps, and I'm taking this from a completely ignorant standpoint, and I think a lot of the audience would be as well, is that... you hear 12 step and you don't think of it as like consecutive steps, right?
Yes.
Is that you have to complete one in order to move on to the next.
Yes.
Am I correct in saying that? So it's from step 1,
Yes.
that is your first step. And once you've completed that first step, only at that point can you move on to the second step.
Like you can't swap your steps around. Like they are put in that order for a particular reason. It's also to prepare you for the next step and prepare you for the next one. So for example, step 4 is about accountability and, in personal inventory, character defects, resentments, sexual inventory, all of those things. Then only once do you understand those, then you move down. But then that prepares you for acknowledgement of your step 9, which is making an amends, which we'll get to. But
right, of course.
You can't make an amends if you don't understand what you have done to yourself and others.
So it's about understanding your personal accountability before taking the actions of apology and things like that. And there's a term that I constantly use for this, and it's just lost me now. But obviously the apologies is a big part of it's coming up before we rush ahead, which I tend to do. So this is step 4, this point of personal accountability. One of my questions I have, and I think this is a good place to stop, because the first 3 steps seem to be a little more vague and ambiguous in a ways that who determines how you've completed this step. So it can be very internal. It's like, I feel like I've completed step 3. I've handed myself over to the higher power. I've understood that they're more powerful than me, things like that. But this 4th step seems to be far more difficult, not only in terms of the internal process, in the physical difficulty or the mental difficulty of this challenging task of taking accountability, of looking within yourself and seeing all the things that you've done negatively. It's extremely difficult to determine how you've completed this step.
So there is actually a way that you determine. So one of the 5 pillars is having a sponsor. So a sponsor is a person that has completed these 12 steps and that, can guide you through these steps. So these are not things that you do alone. I went into treatment. I went into Hearts and House. I've spoken to them that I'm here, so they know that I'm mentioning them. But there are worksheets that you do. There's also like the NA step work guide. There are questions on each and every single step. It's not just I've accepted my higher power, move on to the next step. There are multiple very, very granular questions that give you a call to take action for yourself. Every step and every step work guide, it is really, really intense. So it's not just, you don't just finish, step 4 and move on. So step 5, once you've done the actual written work, this is a lot of written work. Step 4 is probably the most. Then you get to step 5 where you, admit this to God and ask him to remove your character defects, which you do find in step 4. And then you admit it to another person, which is generally your sponsor. And you talk about these character defects, and then an opposite action, which is, how do I alleviate these things?
So this sponsor that you get designated, or someone they volunteer to be your sponsor, however that may work. They are one of the biggest determining factors in terms of you knowing when you've completed a step.
Correct.
So they're there to assist you in saying, listen, I feel like you've done step 4, or I feel like you need more work before you can say that you've
100%,
finished step 4.
Because I mean, I did my first set of 12 steps, which was in December 2020. I think my step 4 was like 2 pages. Like I just messed around with it because I didn't truly understand it and I didn't want to confront myself. I wasn't ready at that stage. This set, I think it's, I mean, we're talking over 100 pages that I've written on step 4. Because I've really I made the decision that I wanted to really learn about who I am and what I've done and what other people have done to me and how I can really identify my character defects, because you cannot change what you don't acknowledge or that you don't have I always say there is no denial, there's only lack of awareness. And if you have a lack of awareness, you don't know, you just don't know. So I made that commitment. But your sponsor is somebody that generally would need to guide you through these steps. And if you are in a rehabilitation process, you would have that with a counselor or, in a group setting. Group therapy is very important for addiction.
Sorry, I feel like I'm putting you off here. I'm making notes. I'm not being rude.
No,
I'm
you're not.
Terribly sorry.
Don't stress.
I just want to take some notes down here because there's a few things that I want to keep here, but I want us to continue through these 12 steps.
Yeah. So then, so your step 5 is admitting to God and to ourselves, to another human being, the exact nature of our wrongs. So that's admitting it to your sponsor. And then step 6, we're ready to have God remove all these defects of character because you identify them. And then step 7 is humbly ask him to remove our shortcomings. We are, as individuals and human beings, we are flawed and we do have shortcomings, and we need the assistance of our higher power to remove that from us, and also just to remind us of them so we can be mindful when we notice those character defects coming up, which they still do. This isn't, you're not going to be, completely changed. We have been using survival mechanisms and tactics our entire lives. I have to constantly remind myself not to be manipulative, for example. That's a survival skill that I adopted as a child. I've even said it to people around me. I'm like, am I being manipulative? Do you feel like I'm manipulating you? Because sometimes my brain just goes back there. So step 6 and 7 is, asking God to remove those shortcomings and character defects, and also just like a reminder of being mindful of those. And then step 8 is writing a list of people. I'm on step 8. So I'm still like baffled. There's so many. To make it so step 8 is made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. So it's people, institution, like it's anywhere where you have harmed anyone, you got to write this list, and when you actually see that list, because there's always the usual suspects, which is like your family, your workplace, or anyone that's directly around you. And then when you start thinking deeper, it extends to others, where you've harmed other people. And that's so I'm on step 8, and it's not an easy one.
Yeah. So look, anyway, congratulations on getting this far so far. And I think it deserves strong congratulations, because you've been through 12 steps before. And as you said, you never put the correct amount of effort in. You weren't ready at that time.
Yeah.
So just to get through the first 7 steps with the amount of effort that you put in, 100 pages or so at step 4 is an incredible effort. So well done to you for that. Let's move on through the rest of the steps, just so that we can close off this chapter.
Yeah. So step
good luck with step 8, by the way.
Yeah, and step 9 is to make direct amends with such people wherever possible, except to do when we've injured them or harmed them. So generally, my sponsor doesn't want me to do step 9. So I'm not going to go run over to somebody's house and be like, hey, I'm so sorry, until I finish my 12 steps. And I need a bit more time to really, about a year. And then once you have some really strong sober time, then, go and do the apologies. And step 10 and 11 are continue to take personal inventory. That's daily. You take personal inventory. And step 11 is sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only for knowledge of his will and the power to carry that out. So that's just daily meditation and trying to stay connected to whatever higher power you have. And step 12 is having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, and to try and carry this message to other still suffering addicts. And that's when you would start sponsoring others, is when you reach step 12, which is something that I'm quite excited about.
It seems like you're very, I believe you're going to be excellent at helping people get through their 12 steps. And I think you'll be a brilliant sponsor, just purely looking at your social media and how passionate you are about educating and helping other people through their dark times. And I'm sure you wish there were more people like you exposed to you during your darkest times. So this was the first point and 5 pillars that you mentioned. Let's move through the rest of the 5 pillars.
Okay, so the 5 pillars of recovery. So like I mentioned, you need a sponsor to take you through these 12 steps. You cannot do that alone. Then you've got step work, which is, all the written stuff. You've got your spiritual, your higher power, whichever that may be. And then you have, service, which is something that I'm very involved in. So service would be like at meetings. Service is not something people think, you need to go do these massive charity drives or whatever. That can be washing cups, packing chairs, anything that is being of service to others, because service is so important, and it's one of my strongest pillars, because I've realized by helping other people, I build my self-esteem, in the sense that I've always externalized my value to others. And for the first time in my life, by being of service to others, I can honestly say that I feel like I'm building a self-esteem that's based on being a good person. So that's a very important one. So I've mentioned sponsor, step work, higher power, service, and meetings, which is also another one of my strongest pillars. I love meetings. I'm there almost every single day. I'm at a meeting, being in the fellowship, hearing other people share their stories, building a sense of empathy for others, which is something that active addiction does take from you. Because you don't love or care for yourself, so you can't give that to others. Being in those rooms, seeing how people have had successful lives. And when I mean successful, it doesn't include anything materialistic. It is just people that have had abundantly beautiful lives, that have got 20, 30, 40 years sober time and have lived an incredible life. It builds hope, faith, and courage, and for me, I love going to meetings, and I love the people there, and I have met the most insanely incredible human beings. So actually all my pillars are pretty strong at the moment, now that I come to think of it. I don't give myself enough credit, but I think that's the difference. I mean, I came into recovery in December of 2020. I've been to rehab twice, and the first time I went to rehab, I had no insight into this thing, and I was just so full of crap. I was just like, this is ridiculous. I was in a toxic relationship, and I blamed the dude, and it was everybody else's fault. And I just couldn't accept it, and that's the difference between that process and ours, acceptance, my step 1, and just putting the work in and living this. I have to live this program because my life depends on it, and it does. So I've had to boundary a lot of people, a lot of places, a lot of things. I've lost a lot of people along this journey that I do love, but their behavior is unhealthy for the road that I've wanted to take. So
I think that comes with the knowledge of this being essential for your survival, correct? So it's like when you make that decision where the amount of things that you're prepared to sacrifice, like relationships like that and things like that, is far, I wouldn't say easier decision to make, because it's always going to be incredibly difficult, but it's a far more necessary decision to make when you have the understanding that this is critical for your survival, because you can see where your life is headed if you continue down a path of addiction, if you continue down a path of or the dark path of your mental health state in general, even if there's not alcohol or narcotics involved in this process. It's not just the drink that you're keeping off your lips. It's not just the cocaine powder out of your nose. There's a lot more to this healthy recovery program than just staying away from substances.
Correct. And I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. And that's why I mentioned in the beginning that this is a behavioral thing, because I've had quite long sober time, in my journey. And my addict behavior was very much the same. Like,
sorry, I just want to clarify there.
Yeah.
This is before your current state of sobriety.
Correct.
So you, as you said, you've been in rehab twice before. Is this your third?
This is my second time.
This was your second time.
Yeah, so I've had 2 tries at this. First one was
a free swing. We'll give you a buy on that one.
Ciao, bye. But this one I took quite seriously. But in between these 2 periods, what I've seen through doing step work properly for a change, my behaviors were very much the same. You don't have a character change. You don't have that character change. So you don't have to pick up a drink. Remember, drugs and alcohol are the solution to this problem.
Yes.
You don't have to, even if you don't have that, you still have a behavioral problem.
Yeah. So relapse is the inevitable ending to this, right? The idea is that relapsing to substances is the inevitable ending to actually not having the healthy recovery.
Yeah. Not
However, it's not necessarily the thing that it's not necessarily the actual problem. So again, as we said earlier, substances aren't the actual problem. It's not the problem you're solving. You're solving a step before the actual substances. You're solving your state, your mental health state,
Correct.
who you are as a human being, your behavioral state. All of those things you're solving before the idea of actual substances. So the reason why a program like this is so important is that you're actually doing healing. This is why you call it healing. Is that you're actually taking these steps of healing where you could just lock someone in a room and keep substances away from them. However, this wouldn't actually heal them of the addiction. It wouldn't actually heal them of the mental illness, the disease that we discussed earlier still exists. It's still there. But to actually heal from that state doesn't mean stay away from substances. You can just keep substances away from people forever and a day, but that's not the actual issue. The actual issue is before that.
And what you say is you just hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's just so clear. You don't need drugs and alcohol to be an addict. Addiction is translated in many, many different ways. And I've had times when I haven't picked up a drink for quite an extensive period of time, but then my behaviors were the same, like the manipulation, dishonesty, secrecy, isolation. It came through in different ways in my eating and, dieting and starving and binging and then overspending money. And, it was like it was running rampage and riot in my life, just in other ways. So the point is that you can be sober for 10 years, but if you do not work a program, the inside of you, there's no spiritual character change that's going to come by, and it will just come through in other ways, which are as bad and as damaging. I think the focus needs to be taken off narcotics and alcohol and realize that addiction is just this thing over here, and it can be in any way in our life. And it comes through like being a workaholic, which I used to be. I mean, I just could not live life without feeling like, if I don't do this, I'm going to get fired. Living very much in fear, and I don't do that anymore. Things like I mentioned, the way that I treated my body in terms of how I ate, was I skinny enough? It's an obsession of the mind, it's an allergy of the body. I mean, it's a behavioral problem. It's starting something you cannot stop. Having complete powerlessness over whatever it is, and it does not need to be drugs and alcohol. And that's the message that I want to impart on other people, because in the rooms and in rehabs and whatever, you are acutely aware of a thing called cross addiction, and that's something that people don't take into account and that's why you need to do the work. You need to heal. Dealing with feelings appropriately. A lot of the time, I grew up in a family where we didn't really talk about much. It wasn't promoted to speak, about feelings. And so I became very isolated, and I also never asked for help. I have an exceptionally independent, very driven mother that, is all encompassing of female empowerment and all these things. But even when my mom struggled, she didn't ask for help. She just carried on. And I adopted these mechanisms of just continuing on.
Normally very admirable traits that have now negatively impacted you by trying to take it on in a negative way. I want to get back to that. I I want to delve into, because this is an extreme concern about mine, and obviously what we're discussing points largely, and it supports the idea that I had originally about addiction, is that it stems from a self-esteem issue largely. I think a lot of people fall into addiction when they have low self-esteem. And I think that we have a self-esteem mental health crisis on the way post-COVID-19, post the pandemic. I think we're going to be in one of the most extreme mental health pandemics the world has ever seen, or at least in recent history, because of people's lack of value. I think that the pandemic, I think that it's something we've never seen before. Life was more difficult 100 years ago. Yes, it was far more difficult 100 years ago. However, people were more critical to their society when life was difficult. And I think what we're finding in today's day and age is that individuals, are feeling less and less important to the rest of their community, to the rest of their society. So their value to society is diminishing. And I think we're creating a massive mental health crisis amongst human beings post-pandemic, where people have been losing their jobs, losing their occupations. They've been isolated from other human beings during lockdowns. And they've developed mental health disorders that aren't being treated, especially in countries like South Africa. It's a discussion that you'll be able to see in some of my other podcasts with Google, where the volume of mental health practitioners and the amount of work that they're able to do is completely inadequate for our population size, and a population that up to 1/3 of people are suffering with a mental health disorder that is completely untreated in a massive population of people. So I think we have a massive crisis on the horizon, and I don't think we're fearful enough about this. I don't think we're having enough conversation about how people can get healthy before they go into a trip of substance abuse. So I wanted to speak to you, now that I've got my rant over, about your state when you started your addiction problem, or when you started using substances to numb yourself from the mental health issues that got you into this place in the first place.
So if we can take a step back.
Sorry, and this is, of course, under the assumption that you have an understanding of this.
Yes, I do have an understanding, quite a deep understanding of this. But, that's the thing. When you grow up in an environment, and I think, our parents are also products of their society, and, what was acceptable and not acceptable, and speaking my feelings and so forth, it wasn't something that was promoted. So where I was I've said this in my shares, that I have always had addict behavior, even as a child. I was an addict long before I picked up. And this was rooted in feeling rejected, having rejection issues and abandonment issues. So my father was an addict. He was a heroin addict, and he passed away when I was 6 to a drug-related disease. He had hepatitis. And feeling that abandonment of my dad, and my mom always working, and feeling quite isolated and alone, that was sort of like the basis and the premise of my life. So what happened? I think my divorce was something for me that was really damaging in terms of my self-esteem. I felt abandoned and I felt rejected, and that sort of opened up wounds for me.
How long ago did you get divorced?
So here's the interesting thing. I got separated from my husband, I think it was like 2015 or something. Okay. And him and I had quite a good relationship. We co-parented really well, and he met somebody else. We were friends during our divorce. We were very close. But he was the constant.
During your separation.
Yeah, we actually maintained a very good relationship, and we raised our girls in quite a peaceful environment. We were always engaging with each other. We saw each other most days. But we actually built quite a strong friendship in that. And then he met somebody else, and my ex-husband was my constant from when I was 18. Like, he was just this person that was in my life. And then obviously that relationship needed to take its natural course. And I really struggled with that separation. For me, I felt blindsided by that, and it wasn't even rooted in a romantic love. It was just that he was somebody that I really, really relied on in terms of consistency. And when he took on this, new relationship, he's married now to a wonderful lady. She's great. I took that really badly. So that opened up ready and existent wounds, which abandonment, rejection, and that made me quite rageful. And not being taught or not having the skill set to deal with feelings or not being able to talk about them and communicate them in an appropriate way, I think that started fueling my drinking. I became resentments to me have kept me sick for a long time. I've always binge drank, like I've always drank. It's just...
So, I mean, you started drinking much like many South Africans around the age of 16 or 17, pre-legalization. Then when you turn 18, it's a big party phase in your life, so you drink quite a lot at the age of 18.
And I worked behind a bar for varsity. I mean,
in a normal way, right? In a way that we wouldn't say is necessarily dangerous to the extent of addiction, right? Where it's substance abuse. At that age, it's fairly normal for people to be consuming lots of alcohol and partying.
Well, I mean, look, I have a different opinion, but I think I've also had to accept that the world's not going to change for me. So I understand, like, all over, when you're 18 or whatever, that's the societal standard of drinking. I don't think any of it's constructive.
No, and I agree. Let me give my views on that before you carry on, so that we don't feel like we're arguing. I think that I actually value alcohol as a tool for people who have a social disorder where people can't be conversational. And I think there's nothing sadder. So I don't have, the reason I bring this up, and perhaps for the viewers and maybe for you as well, is that I don't drink alcohol. I haven't drank alcohol since around 2011. I never went through any program. I didn't feel I was addicted. I drank probably less than the regular South African amount, which I think is far too high in general. But a lot of the time when I say I don't drink, it's not that I'm judgmental of alcohol or any drug consumption. I actually am pro the legalization of recreational drugs, because I feel that it would be more productive to have it legalized and regulated than the current state of things. So I value all of the substances because they're not the issue. The issue is individuals and people. And I think that almost all substances, obviously there's things that are extremely harmful, but almost all substances can be used in a recreational, non-harmful way depending on the individual person. It's rare. I understand that they can be dangerous. I think that people's normalization of alcohol is dangerous. But I think that a lot of people are like fearful. It's like, well, I don't drink so much is the first thing that they say to me when I say I don't drink. I'm like, it's okay. If you like, I'm not judgmental of alcohol consumption. I think people just need to have their own understanding of how much alcohol is too much for them and how much they can consume as individuals. But I think that if I weren't as talkative as I am, or as open, and especially the word talkative, I think anyone would describe me as talkative, is that I'm able to sit down at a table and go meet people out, and someone that is a complete stranger to me, I'll be able to open up and have an honest conversation with them without hiding my opinions and my values and things like that. And I think that inhibitions that alcohol is able to remove for people is a great thing. In small volumes, right? If someone who's very cagey and not able to open up on their opinions and views and things, I think it's great for them to have a couple drinks and then have a normal conversation with human beings. I think that's like, great. You know what? I can see you need a couple drinks to be able to live a healthy life. I think it's a great tool for you because you're able to open up and have a conversation.
Now, we might argue, hey?
We can argue a little bit on that. But you see, this is the thing, though, is that I think that the problem stems from a self-esteem issue. And I think this is where we're going to agree, is that this normalization of alcohol consumption is dangerous, where everyone should be drinking. I think there's very few rare people that alcohol is a good tool in small volumes. You should never get out of control. You should never be doing things that you don't want to do. But I think that it's a nice tool for people to loosen up a little bit, for people who need it.
Okay, so...
And I think that everyone drinks. Like in South Africa, it's in massive volumes. South Africa is one of the biggest alcohol consuming nations on the planet per capita. So it's... And I look at countries like the UK and I'm like, how are you guys going to continue to be a global powerhouse when your youth are consuming alcohol to the volumes that you do and normalizing it? That's not healthy. So those are my views on alcohol, and I think, and substances in general. And I think that, again, it's a self-esteem and mental health issue. If your entire country has a mental health issue like South Africa, where you've got white people living with the guilt of what our ancestors did, and you've got Black people living with the trauma of what they lived through as children or what their parents lived through. and a lack of education and a lack of assistance and conversation around healing these traumas that we have in our past is what's causing substances to look like this horrible bad thing that it is. So now that my rant is over, I will let you address some of the issues that I brought up.
So I think what you're describing there, you're describing people that are not addicts, that are
Yes, 100%.
100%.
I'm describing someone who doesn't have mental health issues. I'm describing someone who is
probably a little bit
just shy and nervous. I'm not talking about a person who has self-esteem issues to a great extent and needs other people to be impressed by them.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are a lot of people, and I say this reservedly. There are people that can consume alcohol in a very responsible way and a very constructive way. And yes, maybe it could be helpful to them. I'm not the measure. I'm not the alcohol police, so I can't really comment on that.
I'm the alcohol police.
But what I can say is that, that's the difference between people have asked me, do you think I'm an alcoholic? Do you think I'm a drug addict? So it's a very simple way to sort of determine that. It's just, I'll give you my experience with alcohol. So I never drank every day. I never drank in the morning. I maybe drank once a week or once every 2 weeks. But here's the difference, right? So people would be like, that's not an alcoholic. But when I started, if I had one glass of wine, I could not stop. It would go to early hours of the morning into the next day. Only when my body physically, sort of Control-Alt-Deleted, did I stop. It's something that I don't have the ability to regulate or to do responsibly or to do it within the realms of normality or societal standards like other people do. I don't have the ability to do that. And then once I do that, then it sort of like meanders into other things. So that's the difference between an addict and somebody that's, doing I just need a bit of wine to like open my mouth and and have something to say or to have a conversation. And they are normal. And most people are normal and they can do those things. I
wouldn't say most people, actually. I don't think blackout drunk is a very healthy place to be for anyone.
And it's not. And I just know like the consequences for me were becoming so great, and I'm not talking about, I never had a car accident or any of that stuff, but the way it made me feel about myself. And that's where the mental health thing comes in.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, I think this substantiates and continues my idea of where I see it, is that moment of getting blackout drunk perpetuated this poor self-esteem cycle for you, and it then restarted or regurgitated or accelerated this cycle of bad behavior that you did afterwards, whether it was negative behavior towards yourself or other people.
So I think any South African can relate to this, a person in this country from any walk of life. When you go out on a Friday or a Saturday or Thursday or whatever, the next day, you are hungover, you feel terrible, you are in a state of guilt and shame. You're like, I'm not going to do this next week. I don't want to do this again. The commitments that you had to a family lunch, you don't go to. You've now pissed off all the people that you love. You become unreliable. Then you've got more guilt and shame. Then you've got your family reacting to that. These knock-on effects for me were becoming like, so often, because I became unreliable, I became isolated. I also started lying about where I was, what I was doing, who I was with, because I had so much guilt and shame attached to what I was doing. And that is impactful to already an existent mental health issues and not being able to deal with my feelings. I didn't have the ability to deal with my feelings. So the minute things got too intense or stress or what I thought I had an anxiety disorder, which I don't. It was actually just alcohol. I'm not anxious and I'm not on any meds whatsoever. I'm so serene and calm now, thank God. But I mean, I just thought I had all these issues. And what it is it's the consequences of abusing a substance. Those are the consequences to your mental health. And then it's sort of like this vicious circle, because you get into, the guilt and shame, and then the guilt and shame, and you're like, screw it, I'm just going to drink again. I'm going to do drugs and I'm going to do all this stuff. It doesn't stop there. And it just fuels the already in existence issues. And I think we can all relate to that. Getting blackout drunk, it's not cute. It's not fun. It becomes more frequent. It impacts your job, your family, yourself the most. And I just know how it made me feel. I just realized like this, I've always been the kind of person that yes, I've pushed and tested like societal boundaries, but I knew like if I did something for too long, that I would always have the ability to pull myself, towards myself and really reroute my behaviors. In the past, I've been able to regulate. I hate mentioning COVID because COVID just was like a nice environment. It was like an environmental place for me for this thing to grow. But COVID highlighted for me how I needed to sit with myself now. And I didn't know how to sit with myself now. My whole identity was formed in my career. And I didn't know who I was anymore. And I didn't know how I felt. And I didn't want to sit with myself. And not having the whole world out there to divert myself from myself was very difficult. And I couldn't handle Jade. Like, I was like, who am I? And I couldn't answer that question. So I didn't want to. So I needed to escape it. And that sort of triggered the more aggressive, more frequent active addiction in me. And it did. And my first attempt at rehab, I walked into Hearts and House. That place is amazing. I mean, I walked in there, I was so full of crap, and the penny still didn't drop because I couldn't accept I was an addict. I blamed everyone else, and it was because of everybody else's actions. And my second try at this in this process, my counselor told me this. She said, if you are wronged, let's say something traumatic happens to you and you press charges and you go to court and you go through the whole system of a court case in the judicial system, and the person or the perpetrator gets off on a technicality and they leave the courtroom and they get in the car and they go home. The world has failed you. The justice system has failed you. You're still living with that trauma. But when you get in your car, you're still responsible for your own healing. And for me, I realized that it didn't matter anymore what everyone had done. It didn't matter that my ex-husband left, that my dad left, that that my mom was overworked and wasn't around. I had to accept that despite all the traumas, despite all the things, and there's been a lot of more like unjust things that have happened to me, that ultimately the way my life goes now is completely and utterly up to me. And I'm responsible for how this thing turns out. And that's the only difference, is acceptance. And I say to myself every morning, acceptance is the answer to all my problems today. Because there's certain things I can do and there's certain things outside of myself I can't do. And I've accepted that I surrendered to my process. And that's the only difference between process 1 and process 2.
And of course, process 1 ended the way that it obviously will, right? Like inevitably, you will not recover, you will not heal unless the process is taken in the way that it has to be taken.
Yeah.
And I think that this is an incredible warning for a lot of people who are listening. And I think what really stands out for me so far in this podcast is the theme and the idea of the substances being largely irrelevant. It's not the actual issue. It's not, and I think that there's lessons to be learned about the consistencies between addiction and other mental health issues. Is the idea of challenging your traumas and taking accountability is one of the big things, and repentance. This is one of the big ones. It's one thing to understand when your actions aren't good enough, but it's another thing to actually take action to resolve those issues in your personality. So I think this is the theme, is that a lot of us are suffering with traumas. A lot of us are suffering with mental health issues. A lot of us are suffering with anxieties, depression, self-esteem issues, things like that. And if we allow them to fester and we allow them to sit, and if there's actions that make us feel more comfortable with those things, like substances would, it like numbs you and it allows you to feel more comfortable with your low self-esteem and it allows you to handle it, is that those crutches are debilitating. They're removing your ability to face your problems with struggle and hardship that allows you to conquer those things and actually solve the problems. And I think this is a theme across all mental health issues, is being honest with yourself, reflection, getting help from people. All of these tools are consistent throughout all mental health issues. And stop the bad behavior in its tracks. Be honest with yourself and be like, no, I'm not going to manipulate people. I'm just not going to manipulate people. I'm not going to do this. And it's difficult. I'm
Yeah.
saying it as if it's an easy thing. I'm not claiming it's an easy thing. It's incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
But it's consistent with different things. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is because I think that these tools are there for other people with different issues. We can't be placing labels on other human beings and being like, oh, but you're an addict. That's not my problem. So it's a different thing that I have to deal with.
Yeah.
And it's not. It's like there's consistencies here.
There, and this is the interesting thing. I was telling somebody the other day about the 12 steps should be taught in schools, in like social sciences and whatever, because mental health issues, there's so much emphasis on drugs and alcohol because I think it's more dramatic and it's more interesting or whatever, but people are suffering with depression and, like you say, and anxiety and all of these different things. And my personal belief is that our self-esteems and our value and the way that we view ourselves has been deeply impacted by social media. People believe that your value is sitting in the car you drive, in the place you go on holiday, in your home, your girlfriend, your boyfriend.
Especially in cities like Johannesburg.
Yeah, your family or whatever. If you attach your value to anything external, you have a problem because those things can be taken from you. And that's why I feel like the 12 steps in recovery and all of that teaches you some really hard lessons about your ego and about humility, because if you put your value in your pocket, you really are playing a dangerous game, and it happened. It's not even going to happen. It happened. I was living like that. I was living like that, like what people thought of me, what car I drove, all of that stuff. And then, in COVID, when it didn't matter anymore, I truly hadn't developed an actual personality of who I am really, what truly matters. What is my value? How do I bring value? It was like the question to myself was what value do I add to the people around me? I mean, like we were living such high-paced lives and whatever, and that's why my narrative changed on social media. I also used to look at my life, it's so great and everything's so perfect. Meantime, I was dying inside. I was literally like, I got COVID and I was jealous that I was pissed off I lived. I was like, why? This is just why. And that's where I got to. And I think that, rigorous honesty, is not, you don't have to go on social media and like air your dirty laundry. But I think it adds to the greater issue, because when we go on there and everybody's lives are perfect, the people that are looking at the phone that are struggling in that day believe that everybody's lives are better than theirs. I did that. I was like, why is everybody living such a great life and I'm not? Why am I so unhappy? Like, how did this happen? And that's why I refused to go in there and pretend that my life was great. It was not great. And I had everything. I still have everything. It was such a judgment for me. I mean, I had people like, why are you so upset all the time? Like you've got amazing kids, amazing career. You're not ugly. Well, I don't think I'm ugly, but people used to tell me I'm not ugly. And I was like, I don't understand it. I don't understand why I'm so unhappy. And it's because I attached my value to everything outside of myself and never ever did any work on myself. And when I was confronted with the things I was doing, I was not a very nice person. I was very self-seeking, self-centered. It was always about me. And having to come to that realization and not knowing what to do with that, what's my default setting? I need to escape this, can't deal with this, go get a drink. And that's what the 12 steps have given me, is like, oh no, hold on a second. These are uncomfortable feelings. It's okay. I'm going to sit in this distress tolerance. I'm actually just going to deal with this. It's not so bad. I'm not so bad. And that's the beauty of it. Well, that's been the most enlightening thing about this experience, is that amongst realizing all the terrible, shitty things I've done, I've also realized that I'm actually a very good person and I bring a lot of value to the people around me, and that I have a greater purpose. And my greater purpose in life is to help other people. And that's why I do things like this. And I share in my meetings because I want to help other people.
Well, I do think you're a lovely person. It's been absolutely lovely speaking to you today about all of this. And the one question I will raise to you, and I'll raise to everyone at home, is that after this conversation, and it's something that you've just brought up about 12 steps being taught in school, and my memory about addiction being taught in school is stay away from drugs, alcohol, and cigarettes, kids. because they're the evil, they're the problem, whatever. And it doesn't seem to be working. It's not solving the problem.
No.
So getting rid of the substances is not actually solving the problem. Let's solve our mental health crisis. Let's solve it early. Let's solve it young. And let's help kids understand and confront their traumas early enough so that we have a healthier community in the future, and we treat each other with more kindness, more empathy, and we have a community of a higher self-esteem, so that we're not blaming social media for our problems, so that we're not saying that it's perpetual, which it is, but it's because our core issue with human beings is that we're not treating each other with value, kindness, and empathy. We're valuing the wrong things. And then social media can just be the thing that it's supposed to be, is a way for us to connect with each other across the world, and not have it be a thing that makes us feel less about ourselves. So let's solve the mental health issue young enough. Let's continue to have conversations like these. If you do want to have conversations like these on a microphone, of course, there's never been a better place to do it than right here. Jade, Gomes, thank you so much. Or should I say Gomes? I think it's much better. I should say it properly. Jade Gomes. Thank you so much for joining me here. I'd love to have you on again so we can discuss this and revisit your recovery and see how it's going. Of course, very big congratulations to you on the upcoming 6 months. Well done. This has been an episode of the Marco Martins Revolution. If you've ever wanted to host a podcast like this one, then be sure to check out vodcasttv.com/revolution to get yourself a discount on your first order of a podcast or podcast series. For me, for now, it's goodbye.